Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com. Looks like finally PwC released their revenue numbers. Yesterday we went over their trust report and we were wondering when the revenues were going to come out, the financial release. Well, it seems they released that the day before this. And I guess that's because all their numbers were ready at once, but I don't know why they didn't release them both on the same day. But PwC released their 2021 revenues, and their numbers were pretty much in line with all the other Big Four accounting firms that have released so far. PwC grew their revenue from $43 billion to $45 billion. And this represents growth of about 5%. And PwC says it's 2% in constant exchange dollars. And this is in line with about the same growth as Deloitte. E&Y had 7.3% growth. So E&Y had better growth on lower numbers. I mean, that's because of the lower amount of revenue. That's typically what happens with E&Y, except for every now and then E&Y has a bad year. But Deloitte had $50 billion in revenue, if you'll remember, and then E&Y had $40 billion. So PwC is smack in the middle of that. And there is no change in the largest accounting firms in the world, and KPMG will bring up the rear when they report. But there was that a few years ago, it's a lot longer than a few years ago, where PwC was the number one accounting firm by revenue, but that's not changing recently. And I think it's really has to do with the amount of people that PwC hires. And if we look into the various growth factors or the areas of growth that PwC measures, we can see that there was no growth in the Americas, which is pretty shocking and pretty bad for PwC. If we look into the way that their services are broken up, we can probably understand why. Now, audit grew at only 1.2%, so that's not good. And if you remember, PwC is the largest auditor and tax advisor out of the Big Four accounting firms, and these kind of stick PwC in the old school accounting world, and their status as the largest auditor restricts how much work they can do on these other engagements, so it really limits their growth there. And I think as long as they stay that way, that they're not going to have that much growth, or they're not going to grow as fast as maybe E&Y could. But when they're talking about the audit performance this year, they said that there's barely any growth, but they do see growth in ESG advisory services. And that's what we talk about a lot on here, of all this new ESG coming about, and PwC being the strongest auditor in the world. I think hopefully they should get some growth from that. If they don't, then it's really something that they missed. And advisory grew 3.1%. And this is pretty common for the Big Four accounting firms to have the consulting line of service be the largest growth sector line of service for them. And PwC is different than the other firms because they don't break out their advisory group into a million different little groups when they report. So it's somewhat helpful to see where their growth comes from. And tax also only grew by 1.7%. There hasn't been any large tax legislation in a while, but we might get some here in the U.S. pretty soon, which would potentially change that number. But you had these two lines of service, audit and tax, that did not grow that much, and there's not that much growth in the Americas for PwC, so it really kept them from jumping up to Deloitte standards. This episode is brought to you by Boomer. Boomer helps you ace the interview at the Big Four accounting firms, and it does this by helping you practice on questions typically asked on the Big Four interview. And if you use the link or promo code which goes to tryvoomer.com/big4, or the promo code BIG4, then listeners get 10% off their purchase. So go ahead and check out their website, tryvoomer.com, and see if you like all the tools they have that can help you prep for your Big Four interview, and you do choose to purchase it. Make sure to use the link in the show notes, because with that link, you're going to get 10% off, or make sure to use our promo code. All the details are in the show notes. Another interesting thing that I saw in this report that I wanted to discuss today was that PwC hired 90,273 new people. This brings their total headcount to 295,000. And this is a lot more than Deloitte hired. Deloitte hired 83,000 this year. And Deloitte is slowing down their hiring. It's 83,000. It's still a lot of people. Deloitte has 345,000 people in total. But if PwC wants to continue growing and gaining on Deloitte, then they are going to have to hire more people than them. So it doesn't shock me that they're doing this. And I think PwC's recent measure that we've been talking about allowing people to work from home, at least in the US, should help them recruit more people. And they obviously need to recruit more people in Americas to keep the Americas growing so that they can win more client engagements and be able to keep their growth going. But another thing too to remember is that PwC had that new equation announcement, how they're breaking their company into basically two reporting sectors. So I'm guessing the way that their financial reporting, the way that they present this revenue report year over year is going to change in the future. They might not show audit, tax, and advisory broken out. It might just be their two new equation solutions, which will be trust solutions and that other group. I don't even remember the name of it. But that might change, and it might make all this more convoluted. And I think that other report where they talked about diversity might be blended into this, so it might even make it more confusing. But I really wanted to cover the basics of the numbers today, and then we'll be diving more into this report because there's a lot of other stuff in here that I wanted to cover in a separate podcast as I analyze this and that report that they dropped yesterday. So that's the podcast for today. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast to get future updates and check out the show notes. Thanks for listening.